Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we have a custom-tailored journey just for you. And we're looking at something that honestly sounds like a dark historical riddle.
It really does.
Yeah. I want you to picture the deadliest railway disaster in recorded history. What comes to mind? Two massive locomotives colliding at top speed, a bridge collapsing into a ravine.
Derailments, explosions, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Well, the disaster we're investigating today involved literally none of those things. Not a single train crash.
No crash at all.
Right. And yet over 500 people lost their lives in a single night.
It's just a massive historical anomaly.
Yeah.
It completely defies all our traditional expectations of what a transit disaster actually looks like.
And it really does. So for today's deep dive, we're pulling our insights from a very sobering documentary transcript. It's titled No Crash, but 500 Dead, the Balvano Train Disaster.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is essentially twofold. First, we need to piece together the unbelievable sequence of events that led to this massive tragedy.
Because it's almost like a clockwork of disaster.
Exactly. And second, we are going to uncover how an event of this incredible scale was practically erased from history.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how something this bizarre and tragic could happen, we have to transport you back to 1944.
Specifically, to Italy.
Right. The geopolitical landscape in Italy at this exact moment is absolute unbelievable turmoil. It's essentially a civil war happening inside the pressure cooker of a world war.
Just to frame the reality on the ground for you, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies in 1943.
But the response from their former ally, Germany, was swift.
Swift and brutal. German forces actually rescued Benito Mussolini and installed him as the head of a puppet state up in the north.
The Italian Social Republic.
Right. Meanwhile, the Kingdom, Italy, was fighting from the south alongside the advancing Allies. So you have a geographically split nation, foreign armies moving through this mountainous terrain, and civilian infrastructure is just completely buckling.
Under the weight of total war, I really want you, the listener, to keep that chaos in mind.
Yeah, it's vital context.
Because when we dig into historical conflicts, it's so easy to focus on grand strategy, troop movements, battles.
A macro level.
Exactly. But for the average person on the ground in a southern city like Naples in 1944, your entire existence shrinks down to basic survival.
You aren't tracking the front lines.
No, you're trying to figure out how to get enough calories to keep your family alive until tomorrow. In a total war economy, civilians are pushed to the absolute bottom of the priority list.
And that survival mindset is really the core driver of this entire story. Every ounce of resource, every ounce of logistical capacity, it was all diverted to the military effort.
Which meant public transit was monopolized.
Utterly monopolized.
Yeah.
Troops and military equipment had absolute priority on the railways. If you were a civilian trying to book a seat on a passenger train, the system had completely shut you out.
And it wasn't just transit, right.
Yeah.
The food supply was entirely commandeered, too.
Yeah.
All the agricultural output being grown on the rural farms was being sent straight to the front lines. The major cities were starving.
In Naples, only a tiny trickle of food was making it to the urban population.
So, if the established system cuts off your food and your transportation, what is the workaround? How were people actually surviving this?
Well, they engineered an entirely barter-based shadow economy.
Out of pure necessity.
Exactly. City dwellers started scavenging or trading for highly valued allied goods. We're talking about things like coffee, chocolate, cigarettes.
High-value, portable items.
Right. They would take these goods out to the rural countryside to barter directly with farmers for essential proteins like dairy and meat.
But the logistical hurdle there is immense.
Massive.
How do you travel from Naples out to the distant farms if civilian passenger trains don't exist?
They became stowaways.
That was literally the only option.
Hundreds of desperate parents and citizens just started climbing aboard heavy freight trains. They'd hide among the cargo in the open wagons just to travel the distances required to make these life-saving trades.
And these unregulated routes became so heavily utilized for this exact purpose that they earned a nickname, right? The Black Market Express.
The Black Market Express.
Yes. We aren't talking about a handful of people hopping a train for a thrill here. We're talking about an improvised, massive transit network functioning entirely on top of moving freight.
And technically, all of this, the train hopping, the unregulated bartering it, was completely illegal.
But the authorities knew.
What's fascinating here is the response from the authorities. They were fully aware the Black Market Express was running right under their noses. But they deliberately turned a blind eye.
Why? Just lack of enforcement.
No, the reasoning is deeply pragmatic. This illegal activity was filling a life-threatening gap in the wartime economy. If the authorities cracked down on the stowaways and halted the black market, the urban population would literally starve.
Wow.
Allowing this shadow system to function was the only way to keep the peace in the cities and prevent a complete societal collapse.
That stark reality fundamentally changes how we view these victims. They weren't criminals exploiting a system, they were parents securing a lifeline.
A very dangerous lifeline.
Yeah, because food and trains weren't the only things in short supply. To understand the trap that was being set, we have to look at the massive industrial shortages. Specifically, the coal crisis.
The resource scarcity extended deeply into infrastructure. At the time, Italy only had a few railway lines that were fully electrified.
Most of it was still steam.
Right. The vast majority of the network relied heavily on steam locomotives, which required massive amounts of coal. And because of the war, high-quality coal, the kind that blend incredibly hot and clean, was nearly impossible to acquire.
So if the high-grade fuel is cut off by the conflict, how is the railway system even keeping the freight moving?
By burning whatever low-grade alternatives they could source, train drivers were forced to use incredibly poor quality coal.
Which is a huge problem.
From an engineering and chemical perspective, it's a nightmare. Poor quality coal doesn't just mean the locomotive struggles to maintain speed because of lower energy output. It fundamentally changes the chemical byproduct of the combustion.
It's dirty.
Extremely. Burning this low-grade fuel produces massive, lethal quantities of carbon monoxide.
And this brings up a crucial piece of biology for you to understand. Carbon monoxide isn't just poisonous in a generic sense. It is a highly specialized, silent killer.
It is deeply insidious.
Yeah.
Carbon monoxide is completely odorless and colorless. And the reason it's so lethal is that it binds to the hemoglobin in your blood hundreds of times faster than oxygen does.
It essentially hijacks your red blood cells.
Precisely. You don't experience the choking reflex or the burning eyes you would get from inhaling smoke from a wood fire. You simply slowly suffocate from the inside out. People often slip into unconsciousness without ever realizing they're in danger.
And the terrifying thing is, there was actually a glaring, fatal red flag regarding this exact issue just weeks before our main story.
There was.
In February 1944, a train was traveling from a U.S. military base along the Barragiano-Tito route. It entered a tunnel, and the confined space rapidly filled with these toxic fumes.
The driver was completely overcome
By the carbon monoxide. He fainted, falling out of the cab and landing right between the locomotive engine and the tender. That's the attached rail car carrying all the extra fuel and water. He was killed.
In any functioning, modern safety framework, an incident like that immediately shuts down the line. You'd see sweeping investigations, mandatory ventilation overhauls, strict fuel embargoes.
But this is 1944.
Right. The official response in early 1944 was practically non-existent. The death was simply ruled a tragic accident.
Unbelievable.
No remedial action was taken. It perfectly illustrates how, in the midst of a devastating war, systemic safety protocols completely vanish. Human life is heavily discounted against the absolute necessity of keeping military logistics moving.
With those fatal ingredients in place, desperate stowaways, an impossible mountain terrain, and highly toxic coal, all it took was one specific train to light the fuse.
The perfect storm.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The timeline begins on March 10, 1944. We are tracking train 8017.
A massive train.
Yeah, a 45-wagon freight train. It departs from Naples on an electrified line. Officially, there are fewer than a dozen crew members on board. But unofficially, how many people are hitching a ride?
Because it started in Naples, hundreds of urban civilians were already tucked away in those empty freight wagons, heading out to the country to make those black market trades.
And the journey began safely enough.
True. The journey began on that electrified line, which temporarily avoided the coal issue entirely. But at 7 p.m., the train pulled into the city of Battipaglia.
And that's the bottleneck.
This is the critical transition point where the infrastructure changes.
Yeah.
The railway workers had to swap out the electric engine for a steam locomotive to handle the mountainous terrain ahead.
And I imagine a delay like an engine swap just gives even more people a chance to board.
It did. During this stop, a massive influx of additional civilians took the opportunity to climb aboard. By the time train 8017 finally left Battipaglia, the number of unofficial passengers had swelled to an estimated 700 people.
700 people.
You have 700 men, women, and children crammed into cold wooden freight wagons meant for lumber and military supplies.
So fast forward to about midnight. The train reaches the Balvano station. It stops for some brief maintenance, and then about 50 minutes later, it begins the truly perilous part of the journey, the slow, winding ascent up into the Apennine Mountains.
This is where the environmental and mechanical realities converge into a literal trap.
It's terrifying to think about.
The train was crawling at a walking pace, barely 10 miles an hour. It was pushing through incredibly thick fog in the dead of night, and looming ahead was the Armi Tunnel.
And this isn't a short underpass.
No, it stretched for 1.8 kilometers, well over a mile straight through the dense rock of the mountain. Crucially, the tunnel featured a relentless 1.3% incline.
Which sounds small.
That might not sound steep to a pedestrian, but for a tremendously overloaded freight train powered by subpar fuel, it is a monumental, punishing gradient.
I want you to picture the sensory experience of being on this train. It is 2 a.m. You are huddled in a dark freight wagon with dozens of other people. The air is freezing, the fog is thick outside, and you are completely unaware of the physics working against the heavy machine pulling you up this mountain.
And then it just stops.
The train simply stops, it stalls out, and the positioning is an absolute nightmare. Almost the entire length of the 45-wagon train is trapped inside this mile-long tunnel with only the last couple of wagons sticking out the back entrance.
The stall was the result of a perfect mechanical storm. First, you have the immense excessive weight of 700 stowaways added to the heavy cargo.
Second, the coal.
Right. The steam engine was burning that poor quality coal, which meant it was starving for power right when it needed maximum output to conquer the incline.
And the weather was a factor too.
Very much so. Third, the physical rails themselves were slick with moisture from the heavy fog. The train was equipped with sandboxes, devices that literally drop coarse sand onto the rails right in front of the wheels to create emergency friction.
But it wasn't enough.
Even with the sandboxes fully deployed, the physics simply failed. The heavy weight, low power, and zero traction meant the train lost the battle against gravity. The wheels just spun on the wet steel.
Stalling a train in a tunnel is terrifying, obviously, but it doesn't automatically kill hundreds of people. This is where a deeply tragic miscommunication seals their fate.
Yeah, the timing couldn't have been worse.
Just before train 8017 entered the tunnel, another train had passed through. Tunnels in this era had notoriously poor ventilation, so this mile-long tube was already thick with noxious smoke.
And now, the drivers of 8017 are desperately trying to restart their engine.
Pushing it to the absolute limit, which is pumping massive clouds of toxic carbon monoxide directly into the enclosed space.
The crew dynamics here are heartbreaking. You had drivers at the front of this massive 45-wagon train and brakemen stationed at the rear. In 1944, there was no radio communication between the front and the back.
They were completely blind to each other.
When the train stalled, the drivers at the front, realizing they simply didn't have the power to make it up the incline, decided their safest option was to reverse. They wanted to let the train roll backward, downhill, to escape the suffocating tunnel.
But the crew at the rear has no idea that is the plan.
None at all.
Yeah.
The brakemen at the rear felt the backward movement. Because they couldn't communicate with the front, they naturally assumed the train had lost its grip on the wet rails and was dangerously slipping backward out of control down the mountain.
So the crew at the back does what they are strictly trained to do in an emergency slip. They slam on the heavy rear brakes.
It's an agonizing misunderstanding.
You literally have the front of the train spinning its wheels, trying to reverse out to save them, while the back of the train anchors them firmly in place. They are pinned inside a mile-long chimney.
And the silent killer goes to work. Because it was the middle of the night, the vast majority of the 700 passengers were deeply asleep in the enclosed freight wagons.
Unaware.
As the tunnel rapidly filled with the dense carbon monoxide, the gas began binding to their hemoglobin. Many of them swiftly slipped from a normal sleep into a toxic unconsciousness and then death, without ever waking up or realizing they were in danger.
The lack of any choking response meant there was no panic in those wagons to wake the others.
What's terrifying is that a few passengers actually did wake up and realize something was catastrophically wrong.
As the oxygen levels plummeted, the drivers at the front of the train, the ones closest to the immediate exhaust, were the first to faint.
But further back, some civilians managed to pry open the heavy sliding doors of the freight wagons.
They disembarked into the pitch-black tunnel and desperately tried to run back along the rails to reach the fresh air at the entrance.
The sheer toxicity of that environment is hard to comprehend. The lack of ventilation turned the tunnel into an active gas chamber. The concentration of carbon monoxide was so overwhelming that those who tried to run were incapacitated almost immediately.
They didn't stand a chance.
They collapsed at the trackside, suffocating long before they could navigate the darkness to the exit. Out of everyone on that massive train, the actions of only one person broke the seal on the disaster.
And that is Mikel Polo, a brakeman stationed at the very rear of the train.
Right.
Because he was in those last couple of wagons that hadn't fully entered the tunnel, or were at least closest to the draft at the entrance, he retained enough consciousness to realize a catastrophic event was unfolding in the darkness ahead of him.
He's really the sole hero in this incredibly dark narrative.
Polo disembarked and made a desperate, grueling run on foot all the way back down the tracks to the Balvano Train station to get help. He finally arrived there at 5:10 a.m.
That timeline is devastating.
It is.
It means over 3 hours had passed since the train initially stalled at 2 a.m. That is 3 hours of those passengers trapped in a localized atmosphere of pure carbon monoxide.
By the time he successfully alerted the authorities, it was far, far too late.
The immediate aftermath is a gruesome logistical nightmare. The station immediately dispatched a rescue train up the mountain to extract the stricken train 8017 from the tunnel.
But when the rescue crew arrived, they physically couldn't get their train close enough to hook up and pull 8017 out.
The tracks leading up to and inside the tunnel were heavily littered with the bodies of the passengers who had woken up and tried to run for their lives.
It took the rescue crews nearly 3 hours just to clear the bodies from the tracks before they could even begin the slow process of pulling the gas-filled train out of the mountain.
The numbers that emerged from those wagons are staggering. The official casualty count recorded by the authorities was 517 dead.
But that's just the official number.
Right. However, internal estimates and later historical reviews indicate the actual number was likely much higher, possibly up to 626 bodies.
And the discrepancy in those numbers highlights the chaotic, desperate nature of the Black Market Express. Because these people were illegal stowaways, there was no manifest.
No paper trail at all.
No one knew exactly who was on board, where they were from, or how many had squeezed into the corners of the wagons back at Battipaglia.
When the bodies were finally extracted from the train, they were laid out in rows at the rural station platform before being hurriedly moved to the local cemetery in Balvano.
Out of the roughly 600 people who died, only 235 were ever positively identified.
The vast majority of these people, who were just trying to secure basic nutrition for their families, were placed into completely unmarked mass graves.
Unbelievably sad.
The only individuals who received formal, documented burials were the official railway crew members.
It is devastating. Over 500 people wiped out in an instant. No massive crash, no dramatic explosion, just a quiet, incredibly toxic sleep.
Which brings us to the second and perhaps most frustrating part of our mission today.
Yes. How does a tragedy of this immense magnitude happen, and yet you, the listener, have probably never heard of the Balvano Train Disaster? How does the deadliest railway disaster in recorded history get functionally buried?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it all comes back to the machinery of wartime censorship.
In 1944, strict military censorship was the absolute law of the land in Italy.
A disaster of this scale was actively and aggressively suppressed by all the competing authorities involved. The Allied forces, who were steadily advancing through the country and attempting to stabilize the regions they captured, absolutely did not want this reported.
They feared it would cause a massive, uncontrollable drop in civilian morale.
Exactly. If the desperate public found out that the very survival tactics they were relying on the Black Market Express had just quietly killed 600 people, the resulting panic could completely destabilize the region behind the front lines.
The censorship apparatus was incredibly effective. They controlled the local press, they intercepted telegrams, and they heavily pressured the local authorities in Balvano to keep the mass burials quiet.
And the Italian authorities had their own deeply selfish reasons for playing along with the silence.
They were desperate to distance themselves from such a catastrophic, embarrassing failure of their own infrastructure and governance.
It was a perfect, grim alignment of political interests to just sweep hundreds of bodies under the rug.
It took 7 years for the silence to finally break.
Because of the suppression, there was no immediate, transparent investigation. It wasn't until 1951, long after the war had ended and the country was trying to rebuild its institutions, that an Italian parliamentary commission finally, officially investigated the accident.
But investigating a highly localized, chemistry-based disaster 7 years after the fact seems almost impossible. What did that commission actually accomplish?
Very little in terms of real accountability, By 1951, the physical evidence was long gone, the train had been reintegrated into the fleet, and the vivid memories of the immediate aftermath had faded or been clouded by the trauma of the wider war.
So what was their conclusion?
The commission ultimately produced a report that placed the blame squarely and rather vaguely on the poor quality coal.
So what does this all mean for the victims? Who takes the blame for half a thousand lives lost in a single tunnel?
The tragic answer is no one. The commission argued that in the midst of a devastating global war, no single individual could be held legally responsible for the massive international supply chain issues that led to bad coal being loaded into that specific engine on that specific night.
Nobody was ever prosecuted.
The train drivers were dead, the wartime system was shattered, and the victims were left completely without justice.
And that lack of justice is heavily tied to who the victims were. They were the poorest of the poor. They were desperately impoverished city dwellers who had been pushed to the absolute margins of society.
They didn't have political power.
The surviving families were so focused on the daily, brutal struggle just to remain alive in a war-torn country that they simply didn't have the luxury, the capital, or the resources to mount a sustained public outcry or demand a government reckoning.
They had to bury their grief and immediately figure out how to get food the very next day.
That is the ultimate synthesis of this tragedy.
Officially, the government classified the hundreds of people who died in the Armi Tunnel as casualties of the war. And in a very profound structural sense, they absolutely were.
But they weren't killed by Allied bombing campaigns, and they weren't killed by Axis bullets.
No, they died from the complete and total disintegration of normal civil life. They died because the invisible structural safeguards of society, the systems that ensure transit networks use safe fuel, the logistics that ensure civilians have access to basic nutrition, had entirely collapsed under the sheer weight of the conflict.
It is a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of our daily safety really is. Extreme circumstances can take an action born of simple, urgent necessity, like hitching a ride on a train to buy groceries, and turn it into a historic, monumental tragedy.
It's sobering.
I want to thank you for joining us on this really intense deep dive today. It is not an easy narrative to process, but it's a crucial piece of history that deeply deserves to be pulled out from under the shadow of wartime censorship.
This raises an important question, one that extends far beyond the borders of 1944 Italy. History books are filled to the brim with the meticulously recorded death tolls of major battles, grand sieges, and military campaigns. But the Balvano disaster forces us to look at the blank spaces on those pages. How much of the true human cost of any global conflict is actually made up of invisible, undocumented systemic failures just like this one? How many massive tragedies are buried under the convenient bureaucratic excuse of wartime necessity, leaving the most vulnerable populations to pay the ultimate price entirely in the dark?